This is Jennifer Pepito with the Restoration Home podcast. This is the show where we talk about the peaceful path to connected families and restored communities. Today on the show, I'm so excited to be chatting with Julia Ubbenga. Decluttering Your Heart and Your Home is her new book. And I'm so excited about the way that this book addresses not just how to declutter, but actually sometimes what is underneath all of the clutter and why do we keep shopping for things that we don't need, and how can we get underneath that so we can do a better job of letting go of those extra things. So thanks so much for joining me today, Julia.
Jennifer, thanks so much for having me. It's a joy to be here speaking with you today.
I'm excited. This is, like I said, when we were just introducing ourselves to each other, it's one of the best books I've read on decluttering because you really
Thank you.
do get to the heart of the matter. Like, you're not just talking about how we can have less pencils around or less
hmm
things. You're talking about why are we hoarding stuff? And I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey to starting to
hmm
recognize that.
Yeah, so I'm an unlikely minimalist. I have not always been one. I grew up close to my grandma, and my grandma loved to shop. And I'd spend time with her. We would stroll the malls together. Gift giving was her love language. She just loved to buy things. And so I soon learned that shopping was fun. I learned that it was a way to feel good, it was a way not to feel bad, to kind of cover up hard feelings. And I carried this mindset with me into my 20s. I started making money, I started spending money, and pretty soon I had all this stuff and $40,000 worth of consumer debt. And so when I thought about the debt, I felt bad. But when I felt bad, I'd go buy something new because that's what I thought would make me feel good and make me feel happy. And so this cycle, it continued until the time our second daughter was born. And I was working outside the home as a speech language pathologist at the time. But I'd always wanted to stay home with our kids. That was my dream, to be a stay at home mom. And so my husband got a promotion at the time and I could stay home. I was so excited. But I had this really idyllic vision of what stay at home mom life would be like. So in my mind, my daughters and I would be baking cookies, giggling over tea parties, we'd be snuggled on the couch reading Little House on the Prairie. So in my mind, it was just going to be great. But a couple weeks into the stay at home mom gig, I would not have even called myself a stay at home mom. I would have said a full time stuff manager would have been a better title because, Jennifer, that is what I did. I was constantly looking for things. I was picking things up, tripping over things I hadn't picked up yet. It was all consuming. I was stressed. I was exhausted. I was distracted. Like I was there, but I wasn't really there. I couldn't really be present to the people around me. And I was just overwhelmed. And so, a couple months into living this way, I was diagnosed with postpartum depression. And I have this memory of this morning where I was up in the nursery in the recliner chair feeding our baby. And I was talking with God. Really, I was pleading with God. I was like, God, what is going on here? This isn't what I signed up for. Something needs to change. And he, um, I just felt prompted to open the Bible and I opened to Luke chapter 12. And a couple of verses just jumped off the page at me. They said, your life does not consist of possessions. Be rich in what matters. And so I paused right there and I asked myself, was I rich in what mattered? Was I rich in relationships, rich in time for prayer, a hobby that I loved? And no, the answer was no. So that planted the seed that something in my life around the area of possessions needed to change, but I didn't know what. I didn't know where to go from there. But that same week, I had a therapy appointment. And at the end of the session, just as I was leaving, the therapist said, Julia, have you ever heard of minimalism? And I'm like, oh, you mean houses with white walls and next to nothing in them? And she's like, no, there's more to it than that. Look into it. I think you might be interested. So I was curious. I did a Google search in the car right after the session and realized that there's a lot of resources out there about minimalism. So I started reading books and blogs about it, listening to podcasts about it. And this idea that I didn't need all this stuff to be happy. And in fact, I'd be a whole lot happier with less of it because then I'd have the time and energy to focus on who and what mattered. It was a mindset shift that was life changing. And it finally gave me a vision of how to get out from under all this stress and anxiety that I was feeling at the time. And so I went all in on minimalism. I started a blog at the time. I called it Rich in What Matters after the Bible verse that spoke to me. And we got rid of 75% of our stuff over the course of the first year. Then we downsized to an apartment for a couple years, got out of our consumer debt, and built our own intentionally smaller new home. And so we've been living this way as a minimalist family for 6 years now. And we have 5 kids, ages 11, 7, 4, 3, and 3 months. And so now I've written the book, Declutter Your Heart and Your Home: How a Minimalist Life Yields Maximum Joy, just to give anyone else the tools who feels called to live a lighter life with less stuff.
Wow, this is incredible, Julia, because I think that so many people, especially homeschool moms, think I could not be a minimalist because I need to have books for my children to read. I need to have all the, paraphernalia of childhood. And, you know, how do you, with 5 children, how do you be a minimalist? Like, how do you say no to all the extra bouncers and bottles and bottle washers and all the stuff that comes along with baby and childhood?
That's a great question, Jennifer. So I think the first thing that has helped me out the most is to realize that kids thrive in a simple environment. Beforehand, I thought I could buy my kid a good childhood, and I tried to. I would buy my daughter something every week. And then I read the research and I realized that kids didn't need more stuff to be happy. She didn't need more stuff. It was only overstimulating her, overwhelming her, just like it was me in the home. There's a study I love out of Germany where they removed all the toys out of a kindergarten classroom and they observed the children and they watched how their play changed. And what they found was that the first day after they took all the toys out, the kids were a little confused. They didn't really know what to do. But then after the second day, they started playing more creatively, more deeply, more independently with what was there in the environment, with the chairs, with the tables. And they concluded that the kids thrived in a simpler environment. They had better problem solving skills. And the same goes for our home. And so once I realized that the more I bought my kids, the more I brought into the home, it was actually hurting them. It wasn't helping their childhood. That really helped me realize, okay, it's okay to simplify our environment. And also, it's interesting just to think that we in the United States have 40% of the world's toys, but only 3% of the world's kids. So, this is a huge cultural thing that we're dealing with as parents. We have so many toys and just a few of the kids. And it really is overstimulating our kids in our home. And so, what I've done for our family, I've just made it part of our culture. It's just they know that before Christmas, before birthdays, we're going to declutter. I give them ownership in the decluttering. We do it together. So I realized that it's what's best for our family, and I've made it part of our culture.
Wow, that's so good. And I totally agree with you. I have a daughter who has a sensory processing disorder, and
Mhm.
that's gotten better over the years, but she really did thrive when there were fewer items in the home. And it's interesting because I see these Instagram school rooms where these, the walls are just plastered with all these beautiful nature posters, but for some children, that's actually going to be overstimulating. If you're thinking about homeschooling, you're planning your homeschool year, you don't need to have all the manipulatives and all the posters. Having just a simple, quiet space, a basket full of your school supplies is enough. And so this doesn't require a lot of money. And one of the things I really love too about your book is you talk about inner decluttering tools because I think so often we buy a lot of stuff for our homes because we feel inadequate or we're comparing ourselves to people online. And we're not really recognizing our identity, who we are and who we were created to be. We haven't taken time to think that through. Or, like you said, we've associated accumulation with some kind of positive thing. I grew up without having a lot. And so there were certainly times in my life where I equated, maybe having certain things with being a valuable person. And I had to work through that with the Lord, with, processing it in therapy or in just even in prayer. One of the on page 11, you have this inner decluttering tool, find your true identity, and it says, what does your mind gravitate to when you're asked to describe yourself? Are your descriptors primarily external, like social status, possessions, professions, or accomplishments, or are they internal descriptors? And I think that's so insightful because in the Restoration Home community, it opens the end of June. we have moms describe their what they want their children to remember about life in their home. So that's one of our basic essential habits is write it down. What do you want your children to remember about life in your home? And it's usually like I want them to feel like it was a safe place. I want them to remember laughter and love. I want them to remember that Jesus was at the center. Never do they say, I want them to have the latest toys. I want them to have the best tools. It's never the focus. So why is it, do you think, that moms feel like they're depriving their children if they don't buy all the newest stuff?
Oh, I love that. I think that it's because of the culture we live in. It's the message that we're fed. It's what we're used to now. A birthday comes around and we have grandparents wanting to buy our kids gifts. We think everyone who comes to the party needs to bring a gift. It's just such a part of our culture that things are going to come in. And yeah, it does become part of our identity too. It's like when we think of who we are, it's our stuff, it's our job, it's our social media statistics, it's those type of things. And those aren't the things in life though that matter. Another tool I write about in the book is it's called the 3 sentence eulogy, and this is more for moms. And I love this tool because it's you ask yourself, what would I want people to say about me at the end of my life? And you only have 3 sentences to write that eulogy in. And what you find is the things that you write, they aren't your possessions. You're not going to write about your couch or your shoes, your designer handbag. It's relationships, maybe your sense of adventure, your faith. And so those are the things you realize that matter in life. And I like that exercise. It gives you some good perspective on that. And I really love the exercise you mentioned too about what you want your kids to remember about your home growing up.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned the eulogy because I learned that from a Donald Miller teaching,
Ah,
and that's another tool that I have, moms, especially I run cohorts of small groups of moms whose kids are under the teen and young adult years, and we write our eulogy because when you have that sort of anchoring point, like, "Here's what I want to be about or I wanna be remembered for," when you have this as an anchor for your life, and this is where I think stories can be really an asset to us, and so I actually, I would consider myself somewhat of a minimalist, but never in regards to books, because I
ah,
feel like it's these stories that give the inspiration even for the eulogy, like being,
yeah.
patient like Ma or like Ruth Bell Graham or, being hospitable like, I talked about in Habits for a Sacred Home, like Ella Tweeten, some of these people who you can read their biographies and see the way people wrote about them, the eulogy that they wrote, basically, the books they wrote about them, and have a vision for what our own lives could be. You talk a little bit in here about the details, like, decluttering our wardrobe, letting go of comparison. You talk about reducing decision fatigue, and I love that. I think often the key isn't just the decluttering, it's also developing different habits. Like I really don't shop for pleasure at all anymore. Like I used to, go browse Target. I went yesterday with my daughter to TJ Maxx for the first time in quite a while. And, it's when we have different systems, like instead of going out shopping when you feel sad or lonely or bored or overwhelmed with your life, write down a list of what you need maybe and then see if you can find it online. What are some of these like practical sort of minimalist decluttering tools?
Yeah. Well, for me, comparison was a big thing when I got into this decluttering journey. And what I realized as I got started, that even as I was letting go of possessions, that sometimes that gave me as big of a dopamine rush as buying something new did. So I kind of got stuck in this cycle of letting things go and then buying things back. And I realized also I was dealing with comparison. So I would let things go, but then I would see things on social media or I would see things the neighbors had. I'm like, oh, I need that too. And so then I'd go buy it back. And I wasn't really feeling this freedom that decluttering can bring when I was stuck in that cycle. So, what helped me a lot was practicing gratitude. It sounds super simple, but it's so powerful. And for an example, if I had been maybe in my kitchen and I was scrolling Instagram and I saw this beautiful kitchen, and then I'm like, oh, mine's not good enough, I would say no. I'd catch that thought, that comparative thought, and I'd say, no, I have food in my fridge. I'm thankful for that. I have a roof over my head. I'm thankful for that. I have a family in this home who love me, and I'm thankful for that. And that really helped me shift out of that comparative thinking and just realize that I was grateful for what I had, and that was enough.
Oh, that's so good, Julia. I think, it's funny because I had heard about, the power of positive thinking or mindsets earlier in my marriage and life journey. But then we were in churches that almost equated that kind of thing with like being new age. And so, there was a season where I wouldn't have really thought about having a declaration or something. But I think that with science, with what we've learned about science and in scripture, I write about this in Mothering by the Book, you see God calling people what they aren't, calling Gideon a mighty warrior when he's hiding. And so you see God doing this exact thing of speaking life over ourselves, of speaking what we want to be true instead of maybe what we perceive as true. And we see it in science really making a big difference in rewiring people's brains for a more positive mindset. And so I love that idea of, when you have these feelings, oh, this lady has so many more Instagram followers, or their homeschool room is better, or their garden is more beautiful. Just saying, wow, thank you, God, that I get to plant a garden, or thank you, God, that I get to homeschool my kids, or thank you that we are, we're doing this ministry together, or we're doing this other project together. Thank you that I have people who are caring for me while I'm feeling sick, or, whatever the life situation, because we're always going to be in the middle of some kind of trial. Life has these ups and downs, these hills and valleys. And if we are constantly comparing our moment with somebody who's in a mountain moment, we're going to be constantly sad. But if we can look at the flowers that are growing in our valley, we're going to have so much more hope and optimism for the future. That's so good. And I really love that you talked about the wardrobe. I think, sometimes as women, I think for and especially in the homeschooling community, I feel like there's almost this like weird modesty where you want to look nice, but also you're supposed to not care about how you look in a way. There's this like, oh, we're too godly to care about that. And then we have these closets full of gingham multi-tiered dresses because we actually really do care. And so I'd love to have you just talk a little bit about this just decluttering and even simplifying, like how many multi-tiered gingham dresses do we really need?
Oh, I love that. Well, we only really wear 20% of our wardrobe. I think most people would agree with that. And that's what studies show. 80% just hangs in our closet. So I would say you keep your favorites. Yeah, we all really have a minimalist wardrobe. We're just hanging on to 80% of the stuff that we don't actually need or use. And I would say somebody else could be using that. So I'd say keep your very favorites. If you want, like, while you're decluttering your closet, take out your very favorite outfit, kind of your gold standard outfit, hang it up, and everyone, you have to love it as much as that one. If you don't love the clothes, don't keep them. And clothes
Yeah.
can also, they can trigger feelings too, like sadness or guilt. If you see something maybe that you wore to a funeral, that can make you feel sad when you see it in the morning, or something that still has a price tag on it and you feel guilty that you bought that. That can make you feel guilty when you're getting dressed in the morning. And you don't want those negative feelings while you're getting dressed. So just keep what you love, and then you'll feel good in what you wear. And I think that then you know that it's just about feeling good with what you wear and owning what you love, and then you can be more focused on whether it's homeschooling or whatever else you're feeling called to do that day.
I love that. I do confess I am hanging on to my smaller jeans as I've entered my 50s. It's a little harder to fit into these smaller jeans, and I don't quite yet want to let go of them. You have a list in your book of 10 things to declutter from your wardrobe: shoes you don't like or that hurt your feet, clothing you don't think you'll ever wear again, purses you don't use, clothes with the tag still attached, clothes that don't fit who you are today, clothes unable to be repaired, any items that make you feel sad or guilty, clothes other people gifted you that you don't love, that one time wear formal outfit, underwear and socks with holes. And I also love that you mentioned in that chapter on, wardrobe, the impact on the world. Like, we could go, yes, we could go to Target every week and buy a new outfit. It's not going to cost us that much. But what is the impact on nations that have really poor policies for chemicals in the way they process material? What is the impact on potentially slave labor, the impact on the landfills, and we're buying a bunch of polyester stuff and then throwing it away after a season. I think there are, maybe bigger things we can think about that might help us be more, sustainable and even loving, like have a little bit more love for our families in the world. And I've really loved some of the research on natural fibers that they can repel some of the toxic radiation. Mixed fibers actually attract that toxic radiation, which is so crazy because it's mentioned in the Bible not to mix fibers.
Huh, I didn't know that, that's interesting.
Yeah,
But
it's
yeah,
there's some fascinating information about the frequency of fibers. I love it. So
fascinating.
just let's talk really quick about decluttering technology because I think, one of the things that's killing us right now, absolutely killing us as wives and moms is too much information. I'm reading a book called, I think it's called Experiencing Jesus by John Eldridge. We had him on the podcast a couple months ago, and he's talking in there about how we have information overload right now. There is just too much information coming at us, too much information available, and it's actually killing our brains. Like, I think there's a lot of moms right now who are dealing with ADD symptoms, and it's partly just because we pick up our phones, maybe to place an order, maybe to text a friend back, and then we're hopping from app to app, checking all our messages, getting a little dopamine hit from, the whatever's going on, and it's just so hard on us. What are some of the ways that you've been able to declutter and detox your digital world?
Yeah, we weren't made to multitask like that, to constantly be tethered to our screens and jump around from one thing to the next to, a child to then a dopamine hit on our Instagram feed or something like that. We weren't made for that. And when we do live like that, we aren't really open to hear God's voice in our life as much either, at least in my experience. So um, I realized that I was living like that, that I was tethered to my phone, especially at the start of this blogging and Instagram creating season in my life, because I would want to check and see what I got, how many blog hits, how many Instagram comments, that type of thing. And so I started doing things like I put my phone on grayscale. There's a study that they did on college kids that showed they spent like 40% less time a day on their screens when they're in grayscale mode. So that's really powerful. Put your phone in grayscale. Also, I put a rubber band around my phone. And so when I started to scroll, I'd have that tactile cue that, oh, I'm not wanting to actually be doing this right now. That was a great reminder that helped me out a lot. And, I also talked about it to like a spiritual mentor. And what he told me, he was like, look at the back of your phone. What symbol do you see on the back of it? Well, for me, I have an iPhone. So it was an apple with a bite out of it. He's like, what better image could there be for a Christian to represent temptation? Like, oh, wow, that was powerful to realize that these phones are designed to tempt us and that we have to have that awareness of how are we using them. So I kept my mornings quiet. I'd put my phone on airplane mode the night before and wouldn't turn it off until I was ready to engage with it in the morning. I would kind of batch answer texts. Like I'd have certain times during the day when I would answer my texts, text back and forth a little bit, but then I would, be done with the texting for a while and just had these set times. So I wasn't tempted just to grab it and see what I got because I knew I would be able to answer that text later.
Oh, you have such a good list in here too, talking about, change how you use social media, raise your awareness, consolidate texting, remove email from your phone, engage in high quality leisure. There's some really, really good insights in here about just some intentional ways because the problem is, like for me in this season of my life, my youngest is 16. He doesn't need a ton of hands-on help with me for homeschooling. I'm lucky enough to get to babysit my grandbaby every few weeks, but you know, we have to, even in a season like I'm in, where I'm not robbing from any other person by being on my phone. I'm still, with my family and being present, but I could spend a few hours on my phone if I wanted to and not be taking myself away from my family. But I'm taking myself away from myself and God is what I'm doing. And so even for those of you moms who, maybe your kids are in school all day and you really could just sit there and scroll and you still organize what need to be organized, you still worked in your garden, you still done some of the things that need to be done. But what about you and what about God? Like what could you do? What gifts do you have inside of you that the world needs that you could be putting energy into instead of scrolling your phone. I think, it is just so easy. I've had to, like, start painting more or just try and find some other things to do, because for me as a homeschooling mom, to not be full-time homeschooling actually has created quite a void, like quite a big hole in my heart, because I just love spending time with my children. And so I think for you, if you're a mom and you're listening to this and you're kind of in a season like this where there's a transition and you're maybe grieving it, instead of just sort of anesthetizing yourself with phone use, maybe take time to journal that with the Lord. Maybe take time to be alone with God and just see what He might have for you next. That's probably not just scrolling your phone. And I'm preaching to the choir here. So, Julia, we're about out of time here. I've loved this conversation. People can find Declutter Your Heart and Your Home on Amazon or at your website, richandwhatmatters.com. Is there any final words of wisdom you'd love to share with the listeners of the Restoration Home podcast?
One thing I think that's worth mentioning is that decluttering your home can give you back so much time in your life. And I think that we don't really realize this, but one study showed that decluttering your home, it reduces the amount of time spent on housework by 40% in the average home. So if you're spending 10 hours a week cleaning and maintaining things, you get 4 of those hours of your life back simply by owning less stuff. And what could you do with 4 more hours a week? You could connect with your kids, you could do nothing, you could rest, you could, read books. So I just think there's so much to be gained from decluttering. Yes, it takes some time that you invest up front, but you get so much of it back. And this book of mine will show you what to do when you have that time that you are decluttering.
Yeah, wonderful. It's such good advice. And I'm really excited for families to discover, declutter your heart and your home, and bring more peace and order into their inner and outer lives. Do you love hearing these tips on decluttering and creating a more simplified life? I think you would also love the Peaceful Press homeschool curriculum. We have a simplified parent guide that includes everything you need except for math and grammar, phonics, or spelling to create a really peaceful year with your children. You're able to teach multiple grades at once. So you could have a kindergarten student, a second grader, a fourth grader, and a sixth grader all listening to the same stories in morning time. And then each child will write a narration based on their level of writing and narrating ability. For the kindergarten student, it might just be drawing a picture. For the second grader, maybe they'll just trace the copy worksheet, or maybe they will write a sentence or even tell you what they remember. And then that sixth grader could write a whole page narration about what you read. So each child is growing in their listening, narrating, communicating, and language arts abilities during this really sweet, simplified morning time. We also include science and history, stories and projects. We include geography and art. Everything is included to create a beautiful literature based education. It doesn't take a lot of hours in the day, so you still have time to work with your children on individual grade level math, or maybe teaching a younger child to read, or working on spelling or grammar with an older child. And it's just $49 a year for our elementary resources. So they're very affordable. Most of the books are available at your local library or even as YouTube read alouds. It makes such a simple, beautiful, and life giving homeschool year. Families say it was the best homeschool year ever after they used one of the Peaceful Press resources. You can save 10% on your purchase with code restoration10 when you purchase at thepeacefulpress.com. Hey, thanks for listening to the podcast. You can subscribe, leave a review, and share. We appreciate your support of the work we're doing here at the Restoration Home Podcast.